Lucas walked through the overgrown path leading to the Funhouse of Madness, each step weighed down by an inexplicable dread that only grew as he approached. The amusement park, long abandoned, loomed ahead like a corpse left to rot under the cold moonlight. The distant, intermittent flicker of faded carnival lights cast distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. A silence that felt wrong surrounded him, too complete, as though the world itself held its breath, unwilling to disturb the secrets buried here. Somewhere, he heard a faint sound. A child's laughter? It faded too quickly, leaving only an unnatural stillness in its place. The entrance to the funhouse gaped wide like a dark, hungry mouth, and Lucas hesitated, feeling as if something were watching him from within. A faint, metallic smell, mingled with a sickly sweetness, reached his nose, like rotting candy and rusted iron. As he stepped closer, the floorboards creaked beneath him, each groan echoing like a warning. He paused, noticing claw-like scratches on the door frame, their origin unknown, but too deliberate to be marks of time alone. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe as if alive, drawing closer whenever he turned his back, only to dissolve the moment he looked again. Inside, dim, dusty bulbs cast feeble light onto peeling wallpaper and cracked mirrors, each one warping his reflection into something grotesque. His own face seemed to leer back, twisted and stretched unnaturally, as if mocking him. A shiver crawled up his spine as he realized his reflection didn't quite match his movements. He stepped forward, and the reflection paused for just a split second too long, then caught up, its eyes hollow and almost hungry. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, but an unseen force, a morbid curiosity, held him in place. He took a deep breath, inhaling the damp, moldy air that clung to his throat. The corridor stretched out before him, impossibly long, lined with mirrors that seemed to multiply with every step. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, breathing in sync with his racing heart. The deeper he went, the thicker the air became, like walking through syrup. Each mirror whispered to him, faint sounds scratching the edge of hearing, words he couldn't decipher but felt instinctively were warning him to turn back. But with each step, it was as if the funhouse pulled him further in, its dark, twisted heart waiting to reveal secrets that should never be seen by human eyes. Suddenly, the sound of slow, dragging footsteps echoed down the corridor, though he could see no one in either direction. Panic clawed at his chest, but his legs refused to move, as if rooted in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer, a phantom presence that threatened to overtake him. A cold sweat prickled his skin, his breath caught in his throat. In the mirror beside him, a shadow moved, distinct and separate from his own, a shape that watched him with eyes that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. As Lucas moved deeper into the funhouse, he stumbled upon a small, dust-covered object lying in the corner of a dimly lit hallway. Bending down, he squinted, brushing a layer of grime off to reveal a familiar shape, an old paintbrush with a splintered wooden handle, warped and twisted like skeletal fingers. His heart skipped a beat. It was nearly identical to a brush he'd owned as a child, the one he'd lost years ago. But this brush was different. The bristles, once soft, were stiff with what looked like dried, darkened paint. Or was it something else entirely? The sight of the brush jolted a memory he'd buried long ago. As a child, he would spend hours sketching in a dim room, creating figures with distorted faces and grotesque, twisted bodies. He remembered one figure in particular, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man he'd drawn from a dream, a face so frightening that he'd hidden the sketch, afraid to even look at it again. Now, in the stale air of the funhouse, that face lingered at the edge of his mind, creeping back with the brush's touch. It was as though the funhouse knew this hidden fear, whispering fragments of his own past to torment him. A chill ran through him as he realized that the brush shouldn't exist here. The funhouse had been abandoned for decades, and yet here was a fragment of his childhood, twisted by time but unmistakably real. A faint rhythmic tapping sound echoed from down the hall, almost like fingers drumming against glass. Lucas tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint melody, familiar and unnerving, a lullaby his mother used to sing, but off-key, dragging out each note in a slow, haunting drawl. The walls around him seemed to pulse, vibrating in tune with the twisted lullaby. Lucas's grip on the brush tightened, his pulse racing. In the reflection of a nearby mirror, he noticed something that wasn't there before, a small, dark smudge in the shape of a handprint smeared across the glass. The handprint was tiny, like that of a child, and as he stared, it seemed to bleed, streaking downward as though someone had pressed against it from the other side. His stomach lurched. The sight was sickening, impossible. He took a step back, only to hear the faint sound of a child's giggle echoing through the hallway, fading into a whisper that brushed against his ear. Driven by a mix of terror and morbid curiosity, Lucas looked down at the brush in his hand, noticing something he hadn't seen before. A name carved into the handle, faint and worn, but unmistakably his own. His fingers trembled, feeling the weight of the object in his hand as if it were alive. The room seemed to tilt, a wave of nausea washing over him as the memories surged back with ruthless clarity. He remembered holding the brush late at night, sketching feverishly, haunted by images he couldn't control, faces he'd later come to believe were mere figments of a child's imagination. But here, in the oppressive air of the funhouse, they felt real, more real than they ever had. Suddenly, his reflection in the mirror twisted, its mouth pulling into a sinister, knowing grin. The face staring back wasn't quite his own. It was older, lined with shadows and hollow eyes, watching him with a dark, hungry intensity. Lucas's pulse quickened as the figure in the mirror lifted its hand, mirroring his movements with a mocking slowness. His own hand, holding the paintbrush, seemed to tremble as if controlled by another force, as if the reflection was daring him to continue. A whispered voice, barely audible, rasped from behind the glass. "You remember, don't you? You've been here before." Lucas continued down the narrow, twisting corridor, clutching the brush as if it were a lifeline, though he knew it was anything but. The path ahead split into two distinct directions, both paths shrouded in darkness, so thick it seemed alive, like an ink-black fog rolling out to meet him. He could feel a pull from each direction, an unseen force urging him to choose. But as he stood at the threshold, a figure appeared in the corner of his vision, a shadowy, spectral form that hovered just out of reach, watching him with hollow eyes that glowed faintly, filled with something between pity and malice. A voice echoed within his mind, raspy and layered with countless voices, as if generations of lost souls were speaking through it. "Make your choice," it murmured, each word scraping against his sanity. "To move forward, you must give something in return." The air grew colder, and Lucas felt his memories slipping away, as though the funhouse itself was rummaging through his past, pulling out pieces of his life, like a predator savoring its prey. He could almost see the fragments, moments with his father, their laughter, the warmth of his embrace, all flickering at the edges of his mind, threatened by the darkness. As he struggled to maintain his hold on reality, the specter gestured to the path on his right. Lucas's heart twisted as he felt the memory of his father pull to the surface, rich with warmth and clarity. It was his most cherished memory, the day his father had given him his first paintbrush, inspiring a love for art that had defined his life. But the funhouse's voice demanded a price. Surrender this memory, allow it to fade into the shadows forever, and in exchange, he could move forward, deeper into the mystery. His pulse raced, a cold sweat beating on his skin as he grappled with the impossible decision. The other path, however, felt darker, colder, an abyss lined with whispers of dread. The voice slithered into his mind again, offering him another choice. He could absorb the essence of the funhouse itself, allowing a sliver of its malevolence to taint his soul. In doing so, he could wield a portion of its power to find his way out. But the cost would be his sanity. Accepting the darkness would mean surrendering a part of himself, a piece that would be forever stained by the horrors he had witnessed. The funhouse seemed to wait, pulsing with an almost eager anticipation, as if it delighted in his torment, savoring the fear that churned within him. Lucas's hands shook as he weighed his options, each more terrible than the last. The memory of his father was like a lifeline to his humanity, the last pure thing he had to hold on to. Without it, he feared he would be lost, reduced to a hollow shell, devoid of warmth and identity. But the other choice, to invite the darkness in, felt like a betrayal of everything he was, a path that would twist him into something monstrous, something no longer entirely human. His breath hitched, the air around him thick and suffocating, pressing down on him with relentless force as he teetered on the brink of despair. In the oppressive silence, he thought he heard his father's voice, faint and distant, as though calling to him from the depths of a memory. It filled him with a desperate, aching grief. The realization that he could lose this forever cast it into the Funhouse's voracious maw. And yet, the Funhouse whispered promises, subtle and beguiling, luring him toward the darker path. It offered him visions of freedom, strength, the ability to conquer the horrors he faced. All he needed to do was surrender, to give in to the darkness and let it guide him through the nightmare. Finally, as the specter watched with those hollow, gleaming eyes, Lucas made his choice, knowing that whatever he decided, he would never leave this place the same. As Lucas stepped down the path he'd chosen, the walls seemed to press closer, suffocating, each breath heavier than the last. A dense, unnatural fog began to fill the hallway, curling up from the floor and wrapping around his ankles like cold, dead fingers. The shadows on the walls appeared to writhe, twisting into grotesque shapes that flickered and morphed with every step he took, as if they were alive, watching him with a predatory hunger. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. A faint whisper echoed through the corridor, barely audible, brushing against his ear like the ghost of a breath. "Lucas," it hissed, his name stretching out, soft yet laden with a sinister promise. He froze, his heart pounding, eyes darting through the shadows, but there was no one there. Just the empty, decaying walls and the faint, eerie glow of cracked bulbs overhead. The whisper came again, louder this time, filled with layers of voices, some young, others old, each carrying a tone of twisted familiarity. The voices began to intertwine, forming a garbled lullaby, as though the funhouse itself were trying to lull him into a false sense of security. But the lullaby was distorted, each note twisted, dragging out painfully in a way that set his teeth on edge, filling him with a dread so thick he could almost taste it. He continued forward, and with every step, the whispers grew more persistent, rising in volume, tugging at his memories and fears. Shadows shifted around him, stretching across the walls, forming half-seen figures that lurked just out of reach. Lucas could feel their eyes on him, watching, judging, as though peeling back the layers of his mind, exposing every hidden fear, every buried shame. He pressed on, desperate to keep moving, but the walls seemed to undulate, almost breathing, creating the illusion that he was being swallowed alive by the funhouse itself. A cold sweat clung to his skin as he approached a corner, where he saw a reflection in the dim, cracked mirror on the wall. But wasn't just any reflection. It was his own face, twisted and hollow, staring back at him with eyes sunken and filled with darkness. The reflection grinned, a slow, sickly smile that spread across its face, showing rows of unnaturally sharp teeth. Lucas took a step back, heart hammering as his reflection leaned closer to the glass, its mouth moving to form words he couldn't hear. His breath caught in his throat as the whispers escalated, filling his mind with fragments of sentences, warnings, and taunts, each one clawing at his sanity. The whispers turned to laughter, low and mocking, filling the air around him with a sense of malevolent joy. He could feel them inside his head, pressing against his thoughts, invading his sense of self. His vision blurred, and the funhouse walls seemed to pulse, each surface twisting with veins of shadow that crawled toward him, reaching like grasping hands. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine, his every instinct screaming for him to turn back, but he knew there was no escape now. The funhouse had drawn him in, and it was hungry. He blinked, and the figure in the mirror was gone, replaced by a dark, endless void. A voice came from within it, cold and hollow, as if speaking from the depths of an abyss. "You're not alone, Lucas," it murmured, sending a wave of dread coursing through him. He stumbled back, clutching the brush, only for the voice to echo again, closer this time, its presence wrapping around him like a vice. The walls whispered, the floor creaked, and he realized with a sickening clarity that the funhouse itself was alive, feeding on his fear, consuming his very essence with every step he took. Just as he felt he might drown in the overwhelming terror, the whispers softened, almost soothing now, like a caress. "Stay," they cooed, seductive and sweet. "We've waited so long for you." The shadows shifted again, forming shapes he couldn't quite make out, each one just as fleeting as his memories of what he'd once been. He felt a sense of vertigo, like he was standing on the edge of an abyss, his mind teetering as the whispers grew more insistent, their words blurring into one another until he could barely distinguish his own thoughts from their voices. In that moment, Lucas realized with chilling clarity, the funhouse wasn't just haunted. It was a prison of lost souls, each whisper a remnant of someone who had once stood where he did, trapped, unable to escape. And if he lingered here much longer, he would join them, his voice lost in the chorus of whispers, another fragment of terror bound to the shadows for eternity. Lucas's breathing grew shallow as he pressed further into the maze-like corridors of the funhouse. Each step felt heavier, as though unseen chains bound him to the ground, tugging him deeper into the clutches of something dark and insatiable. The air was thick, damp, carrying the stale, metallic tang of rusted iron mixed with the cloying sweetness of decaying wood and mold. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into nightmarish figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, leering at him from every angle, their silent taunts filling him with a sickening dread. Then, out of nowhere, the shadows began to ripple, and his vision blurred, casting everything around him in a strange, distorted haze. He blinked, disoriented, and the walls seemed to shift and bend, becoming a twisted landscape of memories that he barely recognized. His childhood bedroom appeared before him, flickering in and out like a dying film reel, but distorted, stretched and warped as though seen through cracked glass. The posters on the walls, once comforting and familiar, now bore twisted, skeletal faces that stared down at him with malicious grins. Each detail felt wrong, uncanny, as if some malevolent force had reshaped his memories into a grotesque parody. He heard his mother's voice, soft and gentle at first, calling his name. "Lucas," it echoed, drawing him closer, a phantom tug that filled him with a mix of longing and fear. But as he moved forward, the voice changed, deepening, twisting into something cruel, mocking, filling the air with a chilling laughter that echoed through his bones. He tried to pull away, but his feet wouldn't obey, as if rooted to the spot by some dark enchantment. The funhouse was playing with him, digging into his memories, twisting them to turn his own mind against him. Suddenly, the walls around him began to shimmer, revealing reflections of his deepest fears, like ghostly apparitions lurking just beneath the surface. He saw visions of himself, trapped in small, dark spaces, gasping for air, his hands clawing desperately at unseen walls. He had always been claustrophobic, the fear tracing back to a childhood incident he'd long tried to forget. But here it was, staring him down, and as he looked closer, he realized he was not just seeing it, he was feeling it, every terrifying heartbeat, every desperate gasp. His chest tightened, and he could almost feel the walls closing in, pressing against him as though the funhouse had come alive, squeezing the life from his lungs. The whispers returned, softer now, more intimate, like secrets shared in the dark. "Give in, Lucas," they murmured, soothing yet sinister. "You're only afraid because you're holding on to something that can't protect you." The voice slithered into his mind, tempting him, playing on his vulnerabilities. "Let go," it whispered, "and we'll take the fear away. You'll finally understand." The lure was intoxicating, a seductive promise of release from the terror gripping his heart. If only he would yield, let his mind drift into the funhouse's darkness. Lucas's resolve wavered as he felt the edges of his mind softening, his fear fading, replaced by an eerie numbness. His surroundings blurred, and he could almost feel himself slipping, like a boat slowly drifting from shore into an endless, black sea. But then, a faint spark of clarity flickered within him, a memory of his father's voice, telling him to face his fears, to hold onto his humanity no matter what. The thought was like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of surrender. But the funhouse wouldn't relent. The shadows around him coiled tighter, whispering darker thoughts, preying on his doubts and regrets. "You're nothing without us," they hissed. "You've been running from your own fears for too long. Embrace us, and you'll finally be free." The reflections in the mirrors around him contorted, morphing into twisted versions of himself, each one grinning with a hollow, empty smile. He saw a version of himself with eyes black as pitch, his mouth curling into a cruel sneer, reaching out a hand as if to pull him into the mirror. A wave of fear surged through him, stronger than anything he'd felt before, his instincts screaming at him to run. But as he looked back at the grinning, empty-eyed reflection, a horrifying thought clawed into his mind. What if he'd already given too much? What if a part of him was already trapped here, lost to the funhouse's darkness forever? That realization shook him to his core, a primal terror that gnawed at the last threads of his resolve, tempting him once more to give in, to let himself dissolve into the shadows, to escape the fear by becoming part of it. With one last, desperate gasp, Lucas tore his gaze away, forcing himself to move, his legs like lead as he stumbled forward. The whispers faded slightly, though he could still feel them, lurking just beneath the surface of his thoughts, waiting for another moment of weakness. The funhouse had left its mark on him, its darkness seeping into his mind like a poison, filling him with a dread that he knew would never fully leave. Lucas stumbled forward, his steps unsteady as he reached the heart of the funhouse, a vast, dimly lit chamber filled with towering mirrors, each one cracked, tarnished, and warped in impossible ways. The floor beneath him felt uneven, shifting subtly, as though he were standing on something alive, something that pulsed and throbbed with dark energy. A chill seeped into his bones as he looked around, his breath hitching at the distorted figures staring back from every surface, reflections that twisted and morphed into ghastly parodies of himself. Each image was worse than the last, with hollow eyes and faces twisted in silent agony, mouths stretched wide as if in an eternal scream. At the far end of the room, one mirror stood out, a massive, ancient-looking piece with an ornate frame covered in tarnished gold and carvings of grotesque, contorted faces that seemed to writhe as he approached. The glass itself was dark, almost black, as if it absorbed all the light around it, and Lucas felt a sickening pull, a sense that something, or someone, was waiting for him inside. He took a step closer, his heart hammering in his chest, a mix of fear and a strange, morbid curiosity drawing him in. His reflection was barely visible at first, a dark silhouette within the inky glass. But as he stared, it slowly came into focus, shifting and solidifying into something that sent a bolt of terror through him. The figure in the mirror was him, but not him. Its eyes were empty voids, deep and endless, and its face was marked with dark veins that pulsed and writhed beneath the skin. It smiled at him, a slow, mocking grin that showed far too many teeth, each one jagged and pointed. The longer he looked, the more he could feel its presence, as though it was reaching out, probing into his mind, sifting through his memories, his fears, and his deepest regrets. A voice, his own but twisted and distorted, echoed from within the glass, filling the room with a sinister resonance. "You've come so far, Lucas," it whispered, each word dripping with malice. "But are you ready to see the truth? Are you ready to face me?" Lucas felt paralyzed, his mind racing as the words echoed through him, a chilling realization settling in. This wasn't just a reflection. It was a part of him, a dark, hidden side that he'd long buried, the embodiment of his fears, his failures, his darkest impulses. He tried to look away, but his gaze was locked, held captive by those empty, soulless eyes that seemed to bore into him, peeling back every layer of his being. Memories flashed before him, moments of regret, anger, shame. Times he'd hurt others, times he doubted himself. Every buried fear now laid bare before this twisted version of himself. The reflection leaned closer, pressing its hand against the glass, and to Lucas's horror, he felt a cold pressure against his own hand, as though there were no barrier between them. "You've hidden from me for so long," it hissed, its voice a mocking parody of his own. "But you can't hide here. This place, it's ours." The figure's hand began to press harder, and Lucas felt a terrible pull, like it was trying to drag him into the mirror, into that dark, suffocating void where his own worst nightmares lay in wait. Desperate, he wrenched his hand back, stumbling away from the mirror, but his reflection moved with him, matching his every step, its grin widening as if it were savoring his fear. The walls around him seemed to close in, the air thickening, and Lucas could hear faint whispers, voices he recognized as his own, each one dripping with despair and malice. They echoed his doubts, his fears, twisting them into cruel taunts. "You'll never escape," they murmured. "You belong to us now." In a moment of frenzied courage, Lucas lunged toward the mirror, hoping to shatter it, to end this nightmare. His fist collided with the glass, but instead of breaking, the mirror seemed to absorb the impact, rippling like liquid, pulling his hand deeper, as though the glass itself was devouring him. His reflection gripped his wrist from the other side, its grip cold and unyielding, and Lucas felt a horrifying chill spread through his arm, creeping up toward his chest. Panic surged as he tried to pull back, but the reflection held tight, its smile growing wider, its eyes darker, as though it was draining him, feeding on his terror. "Face it," the reflection snarled, its voice low and venomous. "Face what you've become." The words echoed through him, and Lucas felt his strength waning, his will crumbling as the funhouse seemed to press down on him, suffocating him under the weight of his own fears. The reflection leaned closer, its face inches from his own, its breath cold and smelling of decay. "You are me, Lucas. I am every fear you've ever hidden, every regret you've ever buried. You can't escape me." But in the depths of his despair, a flicker of resolve surfaced. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Lucas closed his eyes, focusing on the memories he'd fought to protect, the moments of light, the kindness, the love that had defined him beyond his fears. He remembered his father's face, his mother's laugh, the warmth of a friend's hand on his shoulder. As he held onto those memories, the pull from the mirror weakened, the darkness receding as his reflection began to falter, its grip loosening. With a final, defiant shout, Lucas tore his arm free, stumbling backward as the mirror's surface twisted, cracking, until his reflection faded, leaving only the dark, silent glass. He stood there, gasping, his body trembling, as the shadows around him receded, the whispers fading into a haunting silence. He had confronted the darkness within himself, and though the funhouse still loomed around him, he felt a glimmer of hope, a faint sense that he could survive this. But as he turned away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the funhouse was still watching, waiting, ready to test him once more. As Lucas turned a corner in the funhouse, the path abruptly opened into a cavernous room shrouded in darkness. Dim lights flickered from ancient chandeliers, casting an eerie glow over the cracked, uneven floor. In the center of the room stood a towering figure, cloaked in shadows, its form barely distinguishable, but radiating a presence that filled the air with a suffocating dread. Lucas felt his heart hammering in his chest, every instinct screaming for him to flee, yet he stood rooted in place, caught in the thrall of the figure's dark, commanding aura. It was as if the entire funhouse had coalesced into this one malevolent entity, a force born from every fear, every nightmare it had ever consumed. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and Lucas could hear the scrape of something metallic dragging across the floor, a sickening, grating sound that echoed through the room like a death knell. He tried to back away, but his legs refused to obey, paralyzed by an unseen force that held him in place, forcing him to confront the terror before him. The shadows around the figure writhed, shifting and morphing, forming grotesque faces that sneered and laughed, mocking his every fearful thought. Its eyes, hollow and endless, seemed to pierce into his very soul, dredging up every regret, every shame, laying him bare before its silent, monstrous gaze. As Lucas's breath quickened, the entity spoke, its voice a blend of whispers and growls, as though 1,000 tormented souls were speaking in unison. "You've come so far, Lucas," it murmured, each word reverberating through his bones. "But there is a price to be paid for trespassing into the heart of fear." The shadows twisted, tightening around him like cold, invisible chains, and he felt his strength draining, as if the very essence of his being was being siphoned away, fed to the entity that loomed before him. Desperation clawed at his mind, but he could find no escape, trapped in the gaze of the funhouse's dark guardian. The entity extended a skeletal hand, its fingers elongated and sharp, each one dripping with a black, tar-like substance that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. Lucas felt his mind reel as the figure's hand reached closer, brushing against his chest, and an icy numbness spread through him, hollowing him out from the inside. Shadows filled his vision, distorting his thoughts, and for a moment he saw himself through the eyes of the entity, a pitiful, trembling figure, lost and broken, clinging to scraps of hope that were nothing but illusions. He felt a wave of despair crash over him, drowning him in a sense of utter futility. But then, in the depths of his despair, he remembered the memories he'd fought to protect, the image of his father, the warmth of love, the fragments of his life that still held meaning. Summoning a strength he hadn't known he possessed, Lucas forced his hand to move, reaching up to grasp the entity's wrist. The contact sent a shock through him, an intense, burning cold, but he held on, his grip tightening as he stared into the hollow voids where the entity's eyes should have been. "I'm not afraid of you," he whispered, his voice shaking, but filled with a resolve that cut through the darkness. The entity recoiled slightly, as if surprised, and the shadows around it flickered, momentarily destabilized. The faces in the shadows twisted in agony, their mocking laughter turning to screams as Lucas's defiance rippled through the room, disrupting the entity's hold. But it wasn't done with him yet. With a furious snarl, the figure lunged forward, its form shifting into a mass of darkness that wrapped around him, enveloping him in an oppressive void. Lucas felt his own heartbeat slow, his vision fading, as the shadows attempted to smother the last traces of light within him. In a final, desperate act, Lucas forced himself to remember every moment of joy, every spark of hope he'd ever felt, letting those memories blaze in his mind like a fire. The darkness around him writhed, recoiling from the light within, and he felt the shadows weaken, their hold slipping as his will surged against them. With a scream that echoed through the funhouse, he tore free from the entity's grasp, the shadows shattering like glass, fragments of darkness scattering across the room before fading into nothingness. The figure staggered, its form dissolving, pieces of it crumbling away as Lucas's defiance ripped through it. It let out a low, guttural growl, its voice filled with an ancient, inhuman rage. "This is not the end," it hissed, its voice barely a whisper as its body continued to disintegrate. "You may have won, but fear never dies. I will return, and so will you." With one final, hate-filled gaze, the entity dissolved completely, leaving only silence in its wake. Lucas collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his entire body trembling as the weight of what he just faced settled over him. The room was empty now, the shadows gone, but he could still feel the lingering chill, the echo of the entity's words reverberating through his mind. He had survived, but he knew the funhouse had marked him, its darkness etched into his soul, a scar that would never fully heal. As Lucas staggered out of the funhouse, the night air hit him like a slap, cold and sharp, yet somehow refreshing after the suffocating darkness he'd endured. His heart still thundered in his chest, and every part of him felt drained, as though he'd left a piece of himself behind within those haunted walls. He cast one last look over his shoulder, expecting to see the funhouse as it had been, decayed and crumbling. But something was different. The building seemed almost to breathe, its shadows deeper, its walls stretching taller, looming over him with a silent, ominous promise. The moonlight cast long shadows over the funhouse's entrance, and for a moment, Lucas could swear he saw a figure standing there, watching him from within the doorway, a dark silhouette with hollow eyes and that sickly grin he'd seen in the mirror. He blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the still, foreboding structure. A shiver crawled down his spine, a whisper of dread reminding him that while he'd escaped, something of him had remained within those walls, bound to the shadows, waiting. The funhouse had not been destroyed. It had merely released him, for now. As he took a few shaky steps away, an unsettling thought crept into his mind. Had he truly defeated the entity within, or had it allowed him to leave, planting its darkness within him like a seed? He remembered the final words of the entity, echoing in his mind with a chilling clarity. Fear never dies. I will return, and so will you. It was a warning, a dark reminder that this was not over, that the funhouse was a trap from which there might be no permanent escape. Even as he tried to push the thought away, it lingered, gnawing at him, filling him with a sense of unfinished dread. His footsteps echoed in the empty night, each one carrying a strange resonance, as if the funhouse's grip extended beyond its walls, still clutching at him even as he distanced himself. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, his gaze drifting to the bruises on his wrist where his reflection had gripped him. The marks were fading, but his skin felt cold, almost numb, like an icy hand still lingered beneath the surface. As he looked closer, he thought he saw faint lines, shapes almost like faces, swirling beneath his skin, watching him from within. His pulse quickened, and he jerked his sleeve down, refusing to let the fear take hold again. The silence around him felt unnatural, too complete, as if the world were holding its breath. In the distance, he heard the faint strains of carnival music, haunting and distorted, drifting through the air like an echo from a dream. But there was no carnival. The park had been abandoned for decades, and he was alone. His heart thudded painfully, the music tugging at a part of his mind that he couldn't quite reach, a melody both familiar and horribly wrong. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was a trick of the mind, a leftover echo of the horrors he'd faced. But deep down he knew the truth. The funhouse was calling to him, and a part of him was listening. Finally, he reached the edge of the deserted lot, but even there, he felt the funhouse's gaze on his back, a cold, watchful presence that refused to release him entirely. He turned one last time, his eyes tracing the outlines of the building silhouetted against the night sky. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he saw the structure pulsing, almost breathing, as if it were alive, aware of his every thought and movement. He knew then, with chilling certainty, that the funhouse wasn't merely a place. It was a living entity, feeding off the fears of those who dared to enter, each visitor leaving a part of themselves behind. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, mocking whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. Until next time, Lucas, it seemed to murmur, a dark promise woven into the night. He clenched his fists, the fear tightening in his gut, but he forced himself to turn away, refusing to look back again. As he walked into the darkness, he felt a strange weight settle over him, a haunting certainty that one day he would return, that the funhouse would pull him back, no matter how far he ran. The shadows of his own fears, now awakened, would always be lurking, waiting, ready to draw him into the darkness once more. And as he disappeared into the night, the funhouse stood silent and waiting, its hollow eyes watching, its doors slightly ajar, as though anticipating the next lost soul drawn to its mystery. For in the funhouse, fear was eternal, a relentless hunger that could never be satisfied, a terror that could never be fully escaped. And as long as it existed, so too would the whispering shadows, the hollow-eyed reflections, and the sinister melody that would lure the next visitor into its grasp, promising them secrets and horrors beyond imagining. The mystery remained, lingering in the air like a poison, an unbreakable bond between the funhouse and those who dared to enter, a connection forged in darkness and fear.